Alright, in this video I'm going to walk you through the installation procedure for the Vagabond Motorsports Fender Eliminator Kit for the 2017 and newer Yamaha R6. Now before we dive into the installation process for the Vagabond Motorsports Fender Eliminator Kit, I'd like to go over some of the key details of the Fender Eliminator we've built specifically for the 2017 Yamaha R6. So when we say built specifically for it, this is a totally unique part. It's not some universal part we've kind of retooled to make work. We start by laser scanning and hard probing the motorcycle and build a CAD model directly around that. So what you end up with is an incredibly high quality finish that should fit the factory lines of the motorcycle incredibly well. Now, like all Vagabond Motorsports kits, we try to reuse the OEM grade hardware or OEM hardware in terms of lights, fasteners, whenever it's appropriate and when those are high quality. And in the case of the R6, Yamaha's finally seen fit to put on their nice LED turn signals, so those are actually very high quality units nowadays. And we have the teardrop shaped cutouts specifically for those turn signals. We've also got a variety of cutouts in the license plate flange or license plate light flange to run wires out and key into all the features on the OEM license plate light. And so one of the things that you'll see with this kit is it's totally plug and play. There's no grinding, there's no modification, there's no rewiring. This is as high quality and OEM grade fit and finish as you can get with a Fender Eliminator. Like all Vagabond Motorsports Fender Eliminator kits, it's going to be CNC laser cut, CNC bent, all designed and fabricated here in the US in Southern California. It's going to include a set of hardware, in this case 4 K-lock nuts. So these are non-marring locking nuts, a rubber grommet for the top hole to reduce wire chafing on the way out into the subframe, rubber bumpers on the license plate flange to minimize buzzing of the license plate, and it's all going to be coated in a UV resistant satin black powder coat. So it should be a very high quality unit that blends in perfectly to the kind of OEM fit and finish and lines of the motorcycle. As for tools you'll need for the installation, really simple set of tools. You need a 5mm either L key or T handle, Allen wrench, 10mm socket. The only special thing about here is if you have a deep socket, you should use it because we do run some pretty long studs on the part to help you get the first few threads on. A set of needle nose pliers may help with the bullet connectors of the license plate light, and then a Phillips head screwdriver. Now we're going to start the installation process by removing the factory rear fender. First step for that is going to be to remove your seat with the key, or remove the rider seat with the key. Set that aside. You're going to take your 5mm Allen key and you're going to remove the primary seat. And like a lot of Yamaha's newer bikes, you actually do have to kind of pry these little wings back and put either your L key or in this case a long T handle and remove the 2 5mm bolts that hold that rider seat on. So the second one of that, this is the second bolt. You can see if you pull back these 2 wings, you're going to have 1, 2 bolts. Remove the bolt, and then slide the seat rearward. In this case, this bike has not been prepped yet, so those cables are loose. Battery cables are loose. You're going to lift the rider seat off. And then we're going to need to remove this kind of central panel, and that's going to get us access to, or better access to, all the wiring that we need to disconnect. For this center panel, it's just going to be these 4 plastic rivets, and you can either take a small screwdriver. I like to use a little plastic mechanical pencil so that you don't scratch anything, but for all these rivets, if you haven't done them before, you push the center with a tool and you'll hear them pop, and then you can pull the entire rivet out, including the center. So you don't want to push the center too far so that you push it all the way through. In any case, you're going to remove those 4 rivets. And the panel will be fairly loose at this point, but there's 2 little teeth that if you lift that panel kind of from the rear part of it forward, you'll disengage them. Once that central panel's off, you're going to remove this little, what I call tool caddy. It's a little plastic crossbar that's got some of your factory tools if you need them. If you need that 5mm, grab that obviously before you start this process. But again, with your 5mm key, you're going to take these 2 flanged bolts, remove them and set them aside. All this hardware is going to get reused. So once this caddy is kind of loose, you notice it's actually attached to the red plastic of the rear light. So you're going to pull it forward off that little tooth or stud. At that point, it's still fairly captured because it's stuck with all the electrical connectors. And you can either remove the electrical connectors or disconnect them first, or actually just squeeze. There's a black and a white connector, and if you squeeze the little teeth on the back surface of the caddy, you can push them through and at least get the connectors loose. Then you can take the plastic tool caddy as a unit and set it aside. So once the caddy's gone, you just have to release the black and white 2-pin connectors for the turn signals, and these are going to have a big tab on the back here that you push until you hear a click, and then you can disconnect them. So there's going to be a bike side, obviously, that's going to live with the bike during this installation. Then there's going to be the fender side, and you can see the fender side is captured currently under a stick-on clip, a little wire management clip. You're going to open that up by pushing the tab down. You'll release it. You'll see right where that white shrink wrap is where these connectors are locked to the subframe of the bike. If you've worked on the new R1, you'll notice this is all very, very similar. Last thing you'll notice is that there is, unfortunately, the 2 pins for the license plate light are good old barrel connectors, and so those, you're going to grab your set of small needle nose pliers. This will help a lot, and you're going to disconnect those, just because barrel connectors are not always the easiest to disconnect. If you've got something good to grab onto an end, you won't pull too hard and risk pulling the actual. You don't want. You have to go inside of the. I have to try this one without it because it's such a. Remove those two. So you can either use needle nose or you can tug gently. What you don't want to do is pull so hard that you pull them apart, because then you'll bend that cable too much, and if you did that a bunch of times, you'd actually break the cable eventually. So once that's, you've got 3 harness ends. You've got the 2 nice 2-pin connectors for your right and left turn signal, and then the 2 barrel connectors for the license plate light. So once those are all free and you have a clear shot looking at them going into the central hole of the subframe, you can now remove the entire factory fender from the motorcycle. And there's going to be 4, again with your 5mm Allen key, there's going to be 4 bolts, and you'll notice there are little aluminum washer plates under there, and that's kind of important in this install, because the subframe on the new R bikes from Yamaha, R1 and R6, are a single piece of cast magnesium, so they're pretty cool units. But what you don't want to do is just grind the head of a bolt, or a nut for that matter, into them when you're tightening them. So either the nuts that we supply do have integrated washers in them, so that shouldn't be a problem, but we're still going to recommend that you reuse these nut plates, because you don't want to initiate a crack or even just kind of scuff up that magnesium if you can avoid it. So once all 4, I'd say loosen all 4 bolts at least a few turns, because like all factory bikes, there is a good chance there's a ton of red Loctite on those bolts. You are not going to reuse these bolts, so if you want to ditch the T-handle and grab a ratchet with an Allen head adapter on it, that'll give you a little bit more leverage. That kind of popping sound you'll hear is totally normal as a Loctite bolt releases. Because you're kind of working in a deep pocket, just be aware of getting your, there's one of those 2 washer plates. So we're actually going to reuse these guys. We're not going to reuse these bolts. So separate them when you set them aside, because the Fender Eliminator Kit from us has studs pressed in to the Fender Eliminator itself, which is going to make this process in reverse a little easier, because you're not going to have to thread individual bolts down through these holes kind of deep in the fender. But you just got to be patient. What you don't want to do is undo all three, or undo one at a time and get to the point where you have one that's fully torqued, because you may end up binding that one up and stripping out a bolt head or something like that. So once you get to the last one, you can hear this one's a little tight. Hold the entire factory fender with one hand. Hopefully you'll get to a point like this where the T-handle starts to spin freely. Set the wrench down, fish out your last bolt and washer plate. I lost the washer plate, but I'll grab that in a second. And then gently pull the factory fender and the 3 electrical connectors out. And then once you get to those 2 big black and white guys, they can't go out at the same time, so just feed one at a time. And then take the whole factory fender to your workbench and we'll split it apart and get the factory lights out of it. So once you've got the factory fender off the motorcycle, bring it to a flat surface to work on. All we're going to do is take the factory license plate light and turn signals out of this structure. And when you flip it over, we're going to start by removing this kind of gray wire clip, and you kind of squeeze it and roll it over to open it up. It can be a little tricky sometimes. That'll at least relieve all the tension on these wires. You don't need to play around with this huge kind of adapter plate kludge that I think is used to reuse some of the older generation R6 parts. In any case, what we want to do is pull all these cables through, but this little cover plate is going to make that tricky. And so realistically you have to pop the front of that plate out, and then you kind of work your way up, and you should be able to remove it. There's 2 little kind of pins in it that if you kind of rotate it up, you'll get it out of there. And once you're in there, you'll see these are the big, I think, resistors that allow them to use the LED units, turn signals, without kind of putting in different flasher relays and things like that. So these exist on the R1 and things like that, although in a different area. So these are actually gonna go from the fender to the subframe during this Fender Eliminator install. We'll get to that in a bit. But once you've got all the wiring loose, might as well start with the turn signals, because that's kind of where we're at. Like most of the newer Yamaha turn signals, you have a rubber kind of boot that's got a groove, and there's a little insert, and so you got to get that insert out first. And the easiest way is to kind of pry one end of the, try not to rip your fingernails off when you do this, because they are hidden a bit, but you're going to open up one end of that boot and then pull out that insert. And so that insert's gonna, you don't need to slide it all the way off because it's gonna kind of go along for the ride at this point. But then once that insert's off, kind of grab the whole turn signal as kind of securely as you can. You don't want to just grab the end of it and wrench, because there's another bolt in there. So kind of grab it close to the base and rotate it back towards the kind of the front of the motorcycle, and that should allow it to pop out. So once you got it out, you're gonna have to kind of tip over that insert and then thread the whole thing out. And when you look at one of these turn signals up close, you'll see the front is split here, and that allows it to squeeze a little bit. So that's why you want to pull back that way. That allows that to release first. So set that turn signal aside. We're going to really quickly pry. Let's see if I can get it a little better for the camera. Kind of lift up on one of the tabs, and that usually allows you to grab that insert out. But to be honest, it is a little close quarters, but I'm sure you can do it. Pull it out just a bit, then maybe from this view a little more clear, kind of grasp the turn signal and pull it out that way. You'll always have that little insert plate to thread out, and then remove that way. So now all we're left with is the license plate light, and you may be able to see there's two Phillips head screws kind of right above the reflector. And I don't think you need to remove the reflector, but you should be able to get your Phillips head in and release. Now one of these guys, it's kind of interesting, it's going to have a little rubber cap on it, and I think they put that on there to reduce wire chafing possibility at that corner. It's probably easier if you remove that cap so it doesn't get sucked into the threads as you're trying to remove it. So we're going to reuse both these screws, so don't toss them. So once you get those two loose, you just pull, and I think that's why they use bullet connectors, barrel connectors on this, is so they can pull. You can just pull them out through a tiny little hole, and you do that one at a time so that you don't double up and get them stuck. In any case, what you should be left with here, turn signal with two bolts, and license plate light with two bolts, and your two turn signals. And we're going to reassemble them now into the Fender Eliminator. So now it's down to putting the license plate light and turn signals back into the Fender Eliminator, and that's going to start with the turn signals, just because there's a little bit more kind of maneuvering and manhandling of that of the Fender Eliminator, and I wouldn't want you to scratch up your license plate light housing or anything like during that process. So it's important that you get the sides correct, because these are very much unidirectional. You could have right and left turn signal swap by accident. The right turn signal is the white connector, and right is the brake side. Left is looking at the rear, from the rear of the motorcycle. Left is black, or shifter side. So to install these turn signals into the Fender Eliminator is pretty much the reverse of how you got them out. Feed the whole wiring loom through, including that plastic kind of plate insert. Seat the kind of narrow end of the teardrop. You kind of wiggle it back and forth, and you'll get the two kind of flanges of that boot through, and kind of firmly push it to the bottom of that teardrop, bottom being that kind of narrow end at the bottom, and rotate it back in. And you'll have to kind of wiggle it a bit, but you should get to the point where those nose pop, but you'll get a nice kind of clunk as it goes in. Once it's in, you just have to reseat that little plastic inner plate, and that's actually pretty easy. You just kind of push it through those two flanges, and you want to feel them both kind of click over. So we've completed that. I'm going to wait to feed the connectors through that central hole until we get more of this process complete. So again, I'm going to rotate all of this way for this. Actually, it's much easier to kind of push down during this process. So I'm going to flip it one more time. But you kind of get the narrow end. There we go. Trick is always going to be finding kind of a position that you're comfortable reacting with. Okay, so I've got that part seated. Going to firmly press down. Kind of sometimes you do have to jiggle it a bit. There we go. So what you want to see is that it fully pops out the other end. And once you've got that, again, kind of helps to go in at a bit of an angle and seat one side, and then just push it in. There you go. So, but you definitely want to see that tab in that little window of the flange, and your turn signals are good to go. So once you've got your turn signals in, we're going to do a little bit of the wiring now. And so start by feeding the large connector through. You're going to have to kind of, you can see this is a very stiff section, so you're going to have to pay attention to that a bit for both the right and left turn signals. And once you get to this point, because passing the license plate light can actually be done after the grommet's been installed, you have the fun task of feeding these two connectors through this grommet, and then later we're going to install it. And so you can stretch it over the connector or roll it over. Stretching is definitely better for the grommet itself, but once you get to the second connector, so we're going to start with this black one, you're going to have a little bit harder job, but you can still kind of manhandle it about, or what you can do is roll it like that over on itself. The grommet will be fine if that's the easiest way for you to do it, but get it straightened out. And then we're going to slide the grommet. You can do one at a time. It does help a little bit to get those two thick sections, those straight sections through individually. Get your wires coming out of the fender eliminator kind of right and left situated, and then you'll get to a point where you can push the grommet down to the fender eliminator base. Thankfully there's a good amount of squish room here, so you'll just start by feeding an edge of the grommet in. Careful not to scrape your fingers on those studs. But then push the grommet in, and it's not going to be ultra tight, but it will prevent that portion of the jacket from rubbing up against a sharp metal corner. So once you've got to this stage, go ahead and install your license plate light. Now you can see these two fasteners are not captured by any means, but they're pretty easy to keep in one place. So I would leave them there if you've got them. What you'll see is that there's this big plastic tab on the back surface of the license plate light, and that's going to key in perfectly into this little oval slot that's cut into the fender eliminator. So keep that in mind, but start by taking your bullet connectors, and they should fit side by side through. You can flip over the fender eliminator, make sure you're not crossing any wires, but we'll go back to this view because it's the easiest. So get your wiring loom through, and then just line that tab up and these two bolts up, and what you should get is your two Phillips head bolts kind of sitting a little proudly, which means they're kind of sitting in those threaded inserts, but they're not actually engaged. Then take your Phillips head screwdriver and tighten those two bolts up. So for this, you are going to want to make those fairly snug so they don't vibrate loose. You can put a medium strength Loctite, like a blue Loctite, on those if you need, but we haven't had issues with those vibrating loose without Loctite. So now you've got your license plate light on, and the only bit you have to do is take your two bullet connectors and kind of push the license plate, push the turn signal looms down a bit, and then feed the license plate light in the kind of free space. And so once you got to this point, you've got all your looms coming out through that central hole, and you can now install this onto the motorcycle. So as you're getting ready to install the fender eliminator onto the motorcycle, really the best thing you can do is prepare some of the factory wiring on the motorcycle side ahead of time. Get these white and black connectors for the turn signals forward to this crossbar and kind of to the side, and I would actually recommend tucking in your taillight loom into this little wire clip. So get everything over to the kind of the right or the brake side as best you can, and then all you're going to do is feed one by one the turn signal connect. Start with the turn signal connectors up through that central hole, and it is important to pull them forward of that kind of chrome plated crossbar or nickel plated crossbar, forward of that, because you're bringing those long LED tube or the resistor tubes that the LED turn signals require as part of that, and you don't want to have to try to maneuver those later. And then don't forget about your two bullet connectors for the license plate light. Grab those, try to pull, make sure your wiring loom isn't all twisted up on the kind of fender eliminator side, because it'll just get tighter and tighter. But once you've got those looms through and forward, it's easy enough from the top, line up the 4 studs with the 4 holes in the subframe and push the fender eliminator up until it seats. Then holding it in place with one hand, use the other hand to place one of your washer plates on the rear two studs. Those are probably going to be the most accessible. And then one of the locking nuts on the other stud. And you can just spin it down all the way down with your finger. And that's one of the nice things about these K-locks, they don't get tight like a normal nylock. And so we put on long studs on this Fender Eliminator so that because it is kind of working in a deep pocket, the long studs give you a little bit more finger space. And so that's why you're going to need that deep socket. A standard socket may work, but we recommend you have a deep socket in case your standard socket is too shallow. So we've got two of the nuts down already, and you can see the Fender Eliminator is just totally okay hanging out there. Then it's going to be important that you get your second, that front washer plate is going to be a little trickier, but it shouldn't be that challenging to seat. And one thing to note is that these are zinc plated steel nuts, so that if you drop one, you can fish it out with one of those handy little magnets on a stick, as opposed to if we made them stainless steel, you'd have to do something else with tape or something like that, because they'd most likely be non-magnetic. So once you get your four nuts spun all the way down, which shouldn't be, unless one of the threads is gummed up or something like that, should be pretty easy to do. Grab your 10mm socket and tighten all four. And because this is only holding up a Fender Eliminator, it's not otherwise a structural component, you don't need to go crazy tight with this. But feel the lock nut bottom out, and that should be totally sufficient. And having a long enough extension is going to make this important, so that's why I recommend at least a short extension even for that deep socket. So tighten them up. You don't need to go crazy with a star pattern on this 4-bolt pattern, because it's more or less tightening 2 bolt pairs. But always worthwhile to go back once you've tightened everything and just double check that everything is still tight and you haven't kind of settled anything. You'll notice the washer or the grommet in the Fender Eliminator should be directly aligned with the central hole in the subframe, which is good. And once you've got to this point, what I would recommend is you reinstall the tool clip that holds the taillight in place on that little central nub, as well as has a couple Allen keys, and will also fit or hold the connectors. So start by installing the tool clip. So grab your 5mm Allen key again, spin these down. These have inserts in them so that you are kind of tightening through metal, I suppose, instead of just crushing plastic. But these are fairly loose from the factory, so just hand tight, plus maybe, I don't know, a fraction of a turn, a very small fraction of a turn to get them fully seated, and you're good to go. However, once you get to that point, you should have all your, call it Fender Eliminator side wiring on the left or shifter side of the bike, and then you'll have the big black and white connectors for the motorcycle side of the wiring on the other side of the bike. Push those two connectors under that crossbar. The white connector from its factory location has a slightly longer loom on it, so I like to put that one back where it came from, which is in the rearward most position. But for those, you just push them in until you hear it click, and that side of the connector anyways is now seated. Now once you've got the motorcycle side of the connectors in place, what you can do is, you'll notice because we use tall studs, you may say, oh, some of that wiring loom looks a little close to the studs and it may rub. You can take two of the vinyl plastic stud protectors that these ship with and slide them over those studs. And really all that's going to do is kind of isolate the wiring looms from being able to rub on a sharp thread. So the rear two really are in no danger of touching anything, so I wouldn't really recommend putting them on there, but you can put them on the front two studs, and they'll totally kind of blend in and no one will notice them. So once you've got to that point, bring the fender eliminator side of the white and black connectors back under that crossbar and plug them in. And really all you have to do is line up the little fins and push them down to hear them click. And then those are connected. But we do want to do something about this kind of, not really mess, but a service loop that you can improve upon. And so what I would do is reopen that little connector on the right or brake side of the motorcycle and pack in the looms for these turn signals. And you're not going to probably get to the point where you can get these white bands to where they were before, but you still can open up that clip, pack the turn signal looms into them, and close that clip. And that clip just needs to go in, and you can push it. You can give yourself a little bit of, pull some of that tight, but just go in and clip it through. And what you end up with are these two tubes are now more or less, there's not really anywhere for them to go. And so to me that's totally sufficient for wiring management. Then all you have left to do is to connect your bullets for the license plate light. And I would do a similar thing where you kind of wrap them up with the turn signal lights and push to connect. And there are two notches in a bullet. One's like the first engagement, and then one is fully seated. And so make sure you fully seat those. You can use those mini needle nose to make sure you've got that. But then tuck your wiring kind of into as nice a loop as you can possibly make it. And obviously there's not a whole lot of storage back here, so you're not really taking up storage room. But you just want things as they kind of vibrate to not come loose and start rubbing on something. Once you get to that point, I'm going to spin the camera around and we're just going to button up the tail section of the bike. Now once you've got the wiring all buttoned up, all we have to do is reverse a couple of the very kind of simple steps to put this plastic trim panel, which you're going to start by rotating in their front two kind of fingers into those tab positions. Then you can push it back and use those rivets to put them back together. Now the rivets you have to reset, so they're going to be depressed. You have to push the intersection back out. Then simply place them in the hole, make sure everything is kind of firmly seated, and then plunge the center down, and that's going to lock those rivets into position. So install those 4 rivets. There is not a predetermined position for the fronts versus rears. They are all the same. Must have pressed that guy a little early. Okay, so then you're only left with the rider seat, which you're going to start with hooking in that front under that tab, making sure that can't lift up, and then installing the 2 bolts. And you can get a couple threads started by hand, which is always a good idea, so that you don't risk gumming those threads up or at worst cross-threading them. But once you get a few threads on them, grab your 5mm wrench, gently pull back that kind of tail section of the seat so that you don't risk kind of marring it with the wrench. Tighten those 2 bolts. Okay. The last part is going to be to reinstall the passenger seat. And at this point you'll see all the wiring is kind of neatly tucked under. Obviously you don't want any sort of position where these little hooks are going to get in the way of your wiring. So if there is anything, make sure you push it out of the way. And then what you will need to do is use your key to actually open those hooks up. But depress the seat, you're good to go. Now once everything's buttoned up, all you have to do is install your license plate reusing the dealer supplied hardware and do a quick systems check before taking it for a spin. Just give you a couple extra views. You can see how tight the gaps are with the factory body lines and how everything flows kind of well together and how well integrated the factory lights are. I'd like to say thank you for watching this video. Our parts can be purchased directly through our website, www.vagabondmotorsports.com, as well as through Amazon for you Prime members and eBay. Also special thanks to South Bay Motorsports down in Chula Vista for supplying this VM-YR6 for this demo video. This bike can be found on their showroom floor if you'd like to see the parts in person.